Jiu-Jitsu is an explosive sport. Many jiu-jitsu techniques benefit from strength, power, and explosiveness. From takedowns to guard retention, escaping from bad positions, passing guard, or even just holding an opponent down in a pinning position, and so much more. But how do you train to get more explosive? And what does that even mean? Should you train more jiu-jitsu? Should you just do your solo drills faster and more explosively? Well, no. You need to train for power. In this episode, we'll be discussing what is power, the story of athlete A versus athlete B, how to train for power, athlete A and B revisited, and finally a summary at the end. Chapter 1. What is power? Power is your ability to exert your maximal amount of force with as little time or with as high of a velocity as possible. When expressed as an equation, power equals force times velocity. What is rate of force development? Rate of force development, or RFD as it's known, is the change in force over a given period. As an equation, RFD equals the change in force divided by the change in time. What is explosiveness? Explosiveness is a colloquial term used in coaching to describe power or to help to cue an athlete. This term is used commonly to communicate the ideas of training for power. In the scientific literature, there is no term known as explosive, or explosive training doesn't exist. It only exists when referencing to how to communicate with athletes. That's it. When we're talking about lifting explosively, we're talking about the way or a cue to lift the weight quickly with force and what you would think of as explosive. This term in the scientific literature is actually referred to as highly impulsive or focus on your force rate development. Now, these terms don't really translate into the weights room in helping an athlete lift or in helping me to communicate to you in exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about rate of force development and developing impulsivity for power production. The force time curve. Your maximal force for a given movement cannot be reached instantaneously. For example, it takes 0.6 to 0.8 seconds to reach your maximal force output for the leg press. And it takes about 2.5 seconds to reach your maximal force output for the mid-thigh pull. This is just two examples of the different time required to reach maximal force output in different movements. When we translate this to a practical application in sport, basically it means that many different athletic movements require different time to achieve your maximal force output. When we consider that the vast majority of athletic movements occur under 0.3 seconds, it basically means that we don't have enough time to exert our maximal amount of force, so we need to train for power, which is our ability to exert as much force as possible, as quickly as possible. Some movements in jiu-jitsu allow more time for force production than others. Take, for example, shooting for a double leg takedown and driving in to get the takedown versus explosively bridging out of a bad position like bottom mount. This is where the force time curve comes into play. When we take a look at the force time curve, the force is being represented on the y-axis with time being represented on the x-axis. It shows a graphical representation of a typical force production over time, highlighting that the force is not instantaneously developed, meaning you can't go from 0 to 100 instantaneously. Depending on the movement or whatever your body is trying to express, you need time to develop your maximal force. This time will depend on the athlete as well. So we can train for this, and that is what training for power is all about. We can see on this graph that depending on what athletic movement we're looking at or what we're assessing, that will depend on how much power will benefit that movement. A lot of athletic movements in jiu-jitsu occur within 0.3 seconds, but some movements occur outside of that threshold. Chapter 2, the story of athlete A versus athlete B. I want to tell you a story about two jiu-jitsu athletes. We'll call them athlete A and athlete B. Athlete A is able to produce a much greater amount of maximal force than athlete B. However, athlete B is able to generate a much greater amount of force within the first 0.3 seconds of their movements. Which athlete is better prepared for a jiu-jitsu competition? Both jiu-jitsu athletes will have their areas of advantage and areas of disadvantage. It will all depend on what movements or what areas, if you will, of jiu-jitsu we're assessing. Athlete A is more suited to positions that require high levels of maximal force in the form of isometric strength. Take, for example, holding down your opponent in a pinning position. Pinning positions in jiu-jitsu, like side control, back control, even holding someone down in mount, will really benefit from high levels of isometric strength. Whereas athlete B will have the advantage in explosive positions, that movements in jiu-jitsu that are conducted under 0.3 seconds. What is common to both athletes, though, is that they would both benefit from strength and conditioning training, albeit their focus will be different. In the case of athlete A, would be focusing them predominantly on improving their velocity or improving their power, whereas athlete B has that power component and would be focusing on improving their maximal strength. Chapter 3, how to train for power. We've established that power equals force times velocity. So in order to train for power, all you need to do is lift weights really quickly, right? Well, no, there's more to the story than that. You probably have a general understanding that training for strength will increase your peak force, and more or less it's independent from time. Take, for example, powerlifting, where unless specifically training for speed, most powerlifting reps fall outside of the 0.3 seconds we previously discussed. Okay, so if powerlifting movements can train maximal force, then what trains power? Ballistic training. Ballistic training targets your RFD, which is your ability to achieve your peak force quickly in various different movements, depending on what ballistic exercise you're doing. Ballistic exercises are best described as explosive movements, where your aim is to rapidly accelerate against resistance, where either your body, in the case of bodyweight movements, or whatever object you're lifting, which would be a barbell in the case of barbell movements, becomes a projectile. Some examples of ballistic training are plyometrics, medicine ball throws, Olympic weightlifting, and other weightlifting variations and derivatives. These movements are well suited to developing your power and explosiveness for jiu-jitsu, as they encourage full acceleration of the movement, with the deceleration of the system being achieved through gravity, rather than through you actively decelerating the system via your neuromuscular activation. This is a fancy way of saying that gravity slows you down, you don't slow you down. Olympic weightlifting. I mentioned that Olympic lifting is a form of ballistics training. So does that mean that Olympic lifting is the best way to develop your power for jiu-jitsu? Well, actually, no. And this may surprise you. Research on developing power for athletes has shown that it is not Olympic lifting that develops the most peak power for athletes, but it's actually Olympic weightlifting derivatives, or exercises that are used to learn the Olympic lifts, or precursors to develop your skill in able to perform the full Olympic weightlifts. At first glance, this may not really make sense, because how can a precursor exercise develop more force and more power than the actual exercise that you're trying to learn? Well, they've conducted research on this exact question, and they've found that the force time characteristics of an exercise like a mid-thigh clean pull, which is taking the bar from mid-thigh and concluding without the catch phase of a traditional Olympic lifting clean, that movement produces higher values of force compared with power cleans or even hang power cleans. This is because if you remove the catch phase of the lift, then you're simply left with the force production phase, where you're producing as much force as possible, which would enable you to catch the bar. So we're essentially removing the skill component of the lift, and then we're just left with the force production component of the lift. It also has the added benefit of enabling an athlete to lift even heavier than they would with a traditional clean, because again, you don't need to catch the bar. So you can lift even heavier than you would. And again, it's purely focused on the force production component of the lift. For these reasons and more, I do not recommend Olympic weightlifting for jiu-jitsu athletes unless you are already very proficient in these movements. This is because that Olympic weightlifting is a sport unto itself. It's a skill that takes time, dedication, and preferably coaching to master. Therefore, it is a bit of a time sink compared with the goals that we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve maximal power. And as the research has shown, you can achieve these power outcomes without having to do the full Olympic lifts. You can do Olympic weightlifting derivatives or the precursor exercises, and you're going to get arguably even more power production. And at the end of the day, that is what we're focused on. We're not trying to become proficient Olympic lifters. We're trying to become powerful for jiu-jitsu. And if you're still not convinced, I want to draw your attention to a study that was conducted on the jump shrug exercise. This is a movement where you're holding a barbell in front of you just above your knee, and you're essentially generating a jump with a shoulder shrug. This can also be done with a trap bar. The jump shrug is often used as a precursor to the clean. In a study conducted by Sukamal et al., they found that the jump shrug produced significantly greater peak force, velocity, and power than both the hang clean and the high pull across all tested loads. These study results were then repeated by Sukamal and Sol et al. This is excellent news for jiu-jitsu athletes because it means we can implement these Olympic weightlifting derivative movements and get all the benefits from Olympic lifting that we're after without having to actually dedicate the time, energy, and resources into actually doing any Olympic lifting. Quite literally, we can have our cake and eat it too. Power and force. The velocity or speed in which you can move an object is determined by its mass. And when lifting to maximize power output, our intent should always be to apply maximal and rapid force, thus ensuring maximal neural recruitment. Different movements in jiu-jitsu require different motor skills and span the entire force velocity curve. So we need to ensure that our training programs cover all points on this curve. You can achieve this by manipulating your training velocity and your training load, meaning you lift faster and you lift heavier. Or in other words, we lift various different loads at various different speeds. Unsurprisingly, strength training has been shown in studies to predominantly shift the high force region of the force velocity curve, whereas training focused on speed predominantly shifts the high velocity region of the curve. Training for strength makes you stronger, training for speed makes you faster. Research has also shown that training for strength and power simultaneously is the best approach when the intention is to develop explosiveness for athletic performance. However, they recommend that strength or power be the predominant focus of that training block. In a practical sense, this could mean having a training block of 8 weeks focused primarily on power with the emphasis on explosive lifts and ballistic training, with strength work being included as a secondary focus. This power block could then be followed up with a strength training block primarily focused on developing your strength, with power work being included as a secondary outcome. A popular training protocol or training split that follows these principles is known as the condensed conjugate method, made popular by Phil Daru, and it was adapted, as the name implies, from the conjugate method, a strength training methodology developed by the late great Louis Simmons, who is widely regarded as the godfather of powerlifting and the founder of Westside Barbell. The condensed conjugate method can be done as a 2-day or a 3-day split, which focuses on upper body maximum effort paired with lower body dynamic effort, which is the term that they use to describe various different ballistic exercises, with the other day being focused on lower body maximum effort followed by upper body dynamic effort. This is simply one example of a strength-based program with the secondary focus on power. There are many other ways to structure strength and power protocols. But if you are focusing primarily on power with strength as your secondary outcome, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this approach with strength being the focus. And as you'll see in a moment, the condensed conjugate method may not be the best approach for all athletes. Strength training is a fundamental component of developing power for jiu-jitsu, given that power is largely reliant on maximal force. Power equals force times velocity. There is a high and positive correlation between peak power and maximal strength in both the upper body and lower body. Power is developed through physiological strategies involving 2 phases. The first phase involves recruitment and training of fast twitch muscle fibers, or in other words, you have to lift heavy enough to actually recruit type 2A and type 2X fibers. This strength training phase is considered fundamental given the high correlation between the percentages of type 2 fibers recruited and maximal power output. The second phase of training for power involved increasing the firing frequency of these fibers, which should be at a greater volume now because of your strength training. And this is achieved via ballistic training. So maximal gains for power is achieved when you focus on strength and your velocity. Here's an interesting caveat to everything we've discussed so far. The two-phase approach to developing power only applies to athletes that are already strong. How strong do you need to be to benefit from power and strength training? Well, specifically, they've shown in the research that men who are relatively weak, meaning that your barbell back squat, 1 rep max, is less than 1.6 times your body weight, then you will find the greatest improvements to improving your lower body power if you simply focus purely on strength training rather than including ballistic training in your programming. This is because maximum strength is a key factor in developing high power outputs. So in order to fully develop your power potential as a jiu-jitsu athlete, you must have adequate levels of strength first. This further reinforces the findings of the importance of strength training in a power program, as research has shown that your maximal strength starts to decline 2 weeks after not training for strength. You cannot afford to completely neglect your strength training when your focus is for power, because your net result won't necessarily be a net positive. So as jiu-jitsu athletes who are focusing on power, we must include a maintenance level of strength training as a vehicle for driving the enhancement of power. If you want to learn more about specifically how to develop strength for jiu-jitsu performance, then check out episode 1 of the BJJ Strong podcast titled How to Get Strong for BJJ, The Complete Beginner's Guide. Chapter 5, Athlete A versus Athlete B Revisited. With everything that we've discussed so far, let's now revisit the scenario of Athlete A versus Athlete B. As a refresher, Athlete A had a higher amount of maximal force, whereas Athlete B was able to exert a higher amount of force in a shorter period of time, but had a lower maximal force compared to A. So what should these athletes do in order to improve their performance for jiu-jitsu? Well, Athlete A should focus predominantly on power via ballistic training and include strength training as a maintenance in their program. Whereas Athlete B should be focusing predominantly on developing their strength and include ballistic training to continue to develop their power as maintenance. But again, remember, if both athletes are still relatively weak, again in the research, that level was indicated by less than 1.6 times their body weight for the 1 rep max back squat, then they both need to ditch all the ballistic training, ditch all the power training, and focus purely on strength first. Chapter 6, Summary. Power is the ability to exert maximal amount of force rapidly. Power equals force times velocity. Rate of force development is crucial, representing the change in force over time. The concept of explosiveness is used colloquially, and this term is not found in the research, only to describe cues suggested to give to athletes. The force time curve illustrates that maximal force takes time to develop, impacting athletic movements depending on the time available to perform the movement. Power training involves more than just fast-paced weightlifting or lifting weights quickly. Ballistic exercises like plyometrics and medicine ball throws and derivatives of Olympic lifting are effective ways to improve power. Speaking of Olympic lifting, Olympic weightlifting derivatives are better than actual Olympic weightlifting for jiu-jitsu athletes, specifically because of the time, energy, and resources commitment to learn how to do Olympic weightlifting, and the derivatives have been shown in research to produce more power output than the actual Olympic weightlifting movements themselves. Strength training shifts the high force region of the force velocity curve, while speed training affects the high velocity region. A combination of both strength and power training is the most effective way to improve your power. For athletes that are not yet strong, for the lower body, this is determined by being less than 1.6 times your body weight for a back squat. You should focus on strength training solely first, as it will have the most impact in developing your power. Both strength and power are crucial components to developing you as a jiu-jitsu athlete. Whether strength is your primary focus, power is your primary focus, or maybe something completely different like conditioning or mobility, then I've got you covered. My online platform, BJJ Strong Online, is the ultimate jiu-jitsu performance resource. It is science-backed, no BS programs designed specifically for jiu-jitsu athletes and grapplers to develop their performance on the mats. You can check out BJJ Strong Online. Link is in the description of this episode. Thank you so much for watching. Please feel free to like, subscribe, and follow on your platform of choice. Stay tuned for the next episode.